Look down from high enough above the Nazca Desert, and the empty ground stops looking empty. A hummingbird stretches its wings across a space larger than a football field. A spider, drawn in a single unbroken line, spans a distance you could not run in under a minute. Straight lines shoot toward the horizon with a precision that looks almost mechanical, some of them running for miles without a single bend. None of it was meant to be seen this way. No person who created these shapes ever stood where you are standing right now, looking down from the sky. And that single fact turns every other question about this desert into something stranger than it first appears. Consider what that actually requires. To create a shape this large and have it come out recognizable, accurate, proportional, the builders needed to hold an entire design in their minds without ever once being able to check their work from a distance. Every other large-scale image in human history that we tend to marvel at, murals, mosaics, carved reliefs, was built by people who could step back, even just a few paces, and look at what they had made so far. Here, stepping back was never an option. The only way to check whether the spider's legs were correctly proportioned, whether the hummingbird's wings swept back at the right angle, was to trust a plan made before construction ever began, and to trust it completely, for however long the work took to finish. Why would anyone spend enormous time and effort creating an image they themselves could never fully see? A drawing needs a viewer. Somewhere, whether consciously or not, whoever carves a shape into the ground is imagining someone looking at it. But if you carve something so large that a human being standing on the ground can only ever see a tiny fragment of it at a time, who exactly is that image for? This is the question sitting quietly underneath everything else in this story, and by the end, you may find it only gets stranger rather than easier to answer. Before any of the shapes make sense, you have to understand the desert itself, because the desert is not simply a blank backdrop for the drawings. It is one of the driest places on the entire planet, a landscape so starved of rainfall that some sections of it may go years, sometimes even longer, without a single meaningful storm passing through. The ground is not sand in the way most people picture desert sand. It is a hard, flat, reddish-brown surface, made of small stones and pebbles that have sat undisturbed for so long that a thin, dark crust has formed across the top of them, baked and oxidized by relentless sun exposure over an almost unimaginable stretch of time. Walk across untouched ground here, and it barely shifts beneath your feet. It feels less like walking on sand, and more like walking on the surface of a world that has simply stopped changing. At first glance, that emptiness looks total. Flat plain stretches toward flat plain, broken only by low, sun-bleached hills in the distance. And there is a stillness to the place that feels almost hostile, as though the land itself is actively resisting the presence of anything living. But that first glance is deceiving, and deliberately so, because scattered across this seemingly blank stretch of earth is one of the largest concentrations of human-made markings found anywhere on the planet. Thousands of individual lines, hundreds of geometric shapes, dozens of large-scale figures, all of it carved not by digging downward into the ground, but by doing something almost the opposite and almost unsettlingly simple. The temperature here does not behave the way most people expect a desert to behave. Daylight brings a dry, punishing heat that presses down on everything exposed to it, while nightfall can strip that warmth away almost entirely within a matter of hours, leaving the air cold enough to make you question whether you are still standing in the same place. There is no forgiving middle ground here, no gentle transition between extremes, only the daily swing between two harsh conditions that anything living in this environment had to learn to survive. And that, more than anything else, is what makes the sheer amount of effort poured into these markings so remarkable. This was never a comfortable place to work. Every line, every figure, every cleared stone represents time spent enduring conditions that offered no relief and no reward beyond whatever purpose the builders believed they were serving. Here is where the first real shock of this story arrives. Because once you start looking closely at what these shapes actually are, the desert stops feeling empty and starts feeling watched. A spider, drawn with legs splayed in careful, deliberate proportion, occupies a stretch of ground large enough to be mistaken from a distance for a natural rock formation, until you notice that every line making up its body was clearly intentional. Nearby, a monkey curls its tail into a tight, unmistakable spiral, a shape so precise and so instantly recognizable that even without any label or explanation, your brain identifies exactly what animal it is meant to represent within seconds. And then there is the hummingbird, perhaps the most famous of all the figures, its long beak extending outward in a straight, confident line, its wings swept back in a shape that captures motion even while completely still. Elsewhere across the same stretch of ground, a giant condor spreads its wings across a distance that would take a person a full minute or more just to walk from one wingtip to the other, its long neck curving downward in a shape unmistakably built to represent flight. Nearby again, a strange pair of enormous outstretched hands sits carved into the earth with no accompanying body, no explanation, no context beyond the shape itself, fingers extended as though reaching towards something that was never included in the design. These are not crude scratches. These are considered, deliberate, almost artistic renderings of specific, recognizable subjects, made at a scale that removes the ability to appreciate them as art in any traditional sense. And that contradiction is exactly the point where the mystery deepens. If you cannot see the whole shape from the ground, you cannot appreciate its craftsmanship the way you would a painting or a carving held in your hands. So who was this level of care and detail actually for? Was it for beings believed to exist somewhere above the clouds, watching down over the land? Was it for the animals themselves, treated less as art subjects and more as offerings, symbols meant to carry meaning regardless of who could physically witness them? Or was the visual clarity from above never actually the point at all, a possibility we will come back to later, because it changes almost everything about how this story should be understood. For now, sit with this. Somebody stood on this ground thousands of years ago and dedicated enormous time and physical effort toward creating something they knew, on some level, they themselves could never fully see. That decision alone tells you something important about how differently they understood the relationship between an image and its audience. What makes all of this even stranger is how simple the underlying method likely was. There is a common assumption that anything this precise, this large, and this enduring must have required advanced tools or complicated engineering. The truth appears to be almost the opposite. The dark, oxidized surface stones covering the desert sit on top of a lighter-colored layer of ground underneath. Removing the darker top layer, even using nothing more sophisticated than simple hand tools or even bare hands and basic wooden implements, exposes the pale earth beneath it, creating a stark, high-contrast line that would remain visible for an extraordinarily long time in a climate this dry and this undisturbed by wind or rain erosion. In other words, the technology required to create these lines may have been almost embarrassingly basic. No metal tools were strictly necessary, no complex machinery, just the physical act of clearing stones away from one strip of ground and depositing them along the edges, over and over, following a planned path. What preserved these lines for so long was not their construction, but the environment surrounding them. In almost any other climate on Earth, a shallow scrape across the surface of the ground would disappear within a handful of seasons, softened by rainfall, buried under blown soil, or overtaken by returning vegetation. Here, none of that happens. The near total absence of rain means there is nothing to wash the lines away. The compacted, wind-resistant surface beneath the darker top layer means there is very little loose material left to drift back over the exposed ground. Even the wind itself tends to move steadily and predictably across this terrain rather than swirling unpredictably, which paradoxically helps keep disturbed ground undisturbed once it has settled. In a strange way, the same brutal conditions that make this desert almost uninhabitable are the exact conditions that allowed something this fragile in its construction to survive for an almost unbroken span of well over 1,000 years. But here is where the contradiction becomes almost impossible to reconcile comfortably. Simple tools do not usually produce this kind of accuracy. Some of the straight lines across the Nazca Desert run for several miles without deviating in any meaningful way from a perfectly straight path, a level of precision that seems almost impossible to achieve without some kind of aerial reference point to check the work against. And yet, if nobody could see the full shape from above while it was being made, how was that level of accuracy achieved at all? Small-scale planning on the ground, using stakes, cords, and careful sight lines stretched across the landscape, is one proposed method, and it is entirely plausible. But plausible is not the same as certain, and the gap between simple materials and staggering precision remains one of the most genuinely puzzling aspects of the entire desert. Now follow just one of these lines, because numbers and descriptions can only carry a sense of scale so far. Imagine standing at the very start of one particular straight line, stretching out ahead of you across the pale, flat ground. You begin walking. The line does not curve. It does not stop at any natural landmark. It simply continues, cutting through the emptiness in a single, uninterrupted direction. 10 minutes pass, and the line is still going. 20 minutes pass, and the horizon in front of you has barely shifted, because the line seems to be heading directly toward it without ever quite arriving. Some of these lines extend for well over a mile, some considerably longer, running across a landscape with no bends, no obstacles cleared around, nothing to suggest they were built casually or without extreme, sustained intention. Here's a number worth sitting with for a moment, because it rarely gets said out loud in a way that actually lands. If you added together every single line, every geometric shape, and every figure carved into this desert, the combined length would stretch for hundreds of miles, far beyond what a single generation of workers could realistically have completed in one lifetime. That means this was never a single project with a single finish line. It was something closer to an inheritance, a task quietly handed down across generations, each group of builders adding their own contribution to a landscape someone else had already started shaping long before they were born, for a purpose that may have shifted subtly with every generation that carried it forward. Walking a line like this on foot gives you something the aerial photographs never can. It gives you time. Time to feel the heat radiating off the stone-covered ground. Time to notice how the silence out here has a texture to it, heavy and complete, broken only by wind moving across open space. Time to start wondering, somewhere around the 15-minute mark, whether the person who built this considered the walking itself part of the point. Which brings us to the strangest turn in the entire story, the moment where the perspective shifts and the mystery becomes something closer to a paradox. Bring yourself back down to ground level, standing directly on top of one of the great animal figures, the hummingbird, the monkey, the spider. From here, at the height of an ordinary human being, none of it looks like anything at all. You see individual lines crossing your path, but you cannot see the shape they form together. You are standing inside the image, yet completely unable to perceive it as an image. It has effectively vanished the moment you stepped onto it. There is something quietly disorienting about that experience, something worth sitting with a little longer. You know, intellectually, that you are standing on a spider, or a hummingbird, or a monkey's carefully coiled tail, because you have seen the photographs, because the shape has been described to you, because the modern world has already told you what you are looking at before you ever arrived. But strip that prior knowledge away. Imagine standing here without ever having seen an aerial photograph in your life, and the ground beneath your feet becomes almost meaningless. Just lines. Just cleared stone against darker stone. A pattern with no discernible shape, stretching off in directions your eyes cannot follow far enough to resolve into anything recognizable. This single detail forces a reconsideration of everything assumed up to this point. If these figures were purely meant to be viewed, purely meant to communicate an image to an audience, why would their creators design something that becomes invisible the instant you are close enough to actually be near it? A possibility begins to take shape here, one that shifts the entire framing of this mystery. Perhaps the viewing was never the primary purpose at all. Perhaps what mattered was not seeing the shape, but walking it. Following the lines with your body, tracing the exact path of the spider's legs or the spiral of the monkey's tail on foot, step by deliberate step, transforms the experience from something visual into something physical, something closer to a journey or a ritual movement than a picture meant to be observed. Under this interpretation, the shape was never really the message. The walking was. It's a strange thing to consider that an image this famous, this endlessly photographed from above, may have never actually been designed to be looked at by the very people who spent their lives creating it. Now bring the desert's harshest reality into the picture, because nothing about a place this extreme can be separated from the constant, unrelenting problem of survival. Water in this region was, and remains, dangerously scarce. Communities living near this desert depended on underground water sources and carefully managed irrigation systems simply to remain alive in a landscape that offered almost nothing on its own. When your entire existence depends on water that could vanish or fail without warning, water stops being a resource. It becomes something closer to a matter of faith, something worth pleading for, honoring, or trying desperately to influence through whatever means felt available. Some of the desert's designs sit disturbingly close to this theme. Straight lines converge at specific points across the landscape in patterns that some interpretations connect to underground water sources or seasonal water flow. Beneath parts of this region, hidden channels were carved directly into the earth to move water across long distances without losing it to the punishing evaporation of open desert air, a quiet, patient kind of engineering that never announces itself the way the enormous surface figures do, yet may have mattered more to daily survival than any of the drawings above it. Somewhere in the relationship between what was hidden underground and what was carved openly across the surface, ritual and practicality seemed to blur into a single, unified concern. Whether or not every single line was created with water directly in mind, the broader picture becomes clear rather quickly. A society living under this much environmental pressure was almost certainly not creating these markings purely as decoration. Ritual, survival, and landscape were tangled together here in ways that are difficult to fully untangle from a distance of thousands of years. This leads to something worth introducing carefully, because it complicates the picture in an important way. Not everything carved into this desert appears to serve the same purpose. There seem to be, in a sense, two different Nazcas layered on top of each other across the same stretch of ground. One set of markings, the long, straight lines and the enormous geometric shapes, trapezoids, triangles, spirals stretched across huge distances, feels more closely tied to movement, to pathways, to something ceremonial and repeated over time by many feet crossing the same ground again and again. The other set, the instantly recognizable animal figures, feels different in character entirely, more symbolic, more specific, almost like individual statements rather than repeated ritual routes. The geometric shapes tend to cluster in certain sections of the desert almost as though they belong to a shared, evolving vocabulary, one trapezoid echoing the angle of another built nearby, one spiral seeming to answer a similar spiral built some distance away, as though whoever added each new shape was working within an established visual language rather than inventing something entirely new each time. The animal figures, by contrast, tend to stand more separately, more individually, each one distinct enough in style and subject that they feel less like variations on a shared theme and more like separate acts of creation, each with its own specific purpose that may never have overlapped neatly with the purpose behind the lines running near it. If that distinction holds any truth to it, then the desert was never a single unified message at all. It may have functioned as multiple overlapping systems, built by people who understood the landscape as something to be used in several different ways depending on need, occasion, or belief, rather than a single coordinated art project stretched across centuries. So what were these markings actually for? Several explanations have been proposed over time, and it's worth walking through them honestly, without pretending any single one has been definitively settled. Some point toward astronomy, the idea that certain lines align with the position of the sun, the moon, or specific stars at particular times of year, functioning as a kind of enormous calendar stretched across the ground rather than carved into stone or wood, marking the turning of seasons in a landscape where knowing exactly when to expect a change in water flow could mean the difference between a good year and a devastating one. Others point toward pilgrimage, the idea that people walked specific routes across the desert as part of religious or communal practice, the lines acting less like art and more like a physical script for movement and devotion. Each journey along a particular path, repeating something that had been repeated by countless feet before it. Communication is another proposed thread, the possibility that these markings served as signals or messages meant for other communities, other travelers, or forces the builders believed were watching from somewhere beyond ordinary sight, a way of marking territory or announcing identity to anyone who might eventually pass through. There is also a more social explanation worth considering. The idea that constructing and maintaining these enormous shared works may have served to bind communities together, giving large groups of people a collective purpose and a physical, visible symbol of their shared identity, regardless of who else ever saw the result. And there is the more spiritual interpretation, tied closely to water and survival, framing the lines and figures as offerings, gestures made toward forces the community depended on for their continued existence in one of the harshest environments on the planet. None of these explanations cancel each other out entirely. It's entirely possible that different sections of this same desert served different functions across different periods of time, shaped by generations who inherited a landscape already covered in older markings and simply continued the tradition in their own way, for their own specific reasons. The honest answer, even now, is that certainty remains out of reach, and that uncertainty is part of what keeps pulling people back to this desert again and again. Here's a twist worth sitting with, because it's genuinely strange in a way most ancient mysteries aren't. For most of the last century, discovering a new Nazca figure meant physically walking or flying over the desert and hoping to spot something the human eye had somehow missed before. That has quietly changed. In recent years, tireless digital eyes, scanning satellite and aerial imagery pixel by pixel across enormous stretches of terrain, have begun finding new figures human observers walk directly past for generations without ever noticing. Small, faded shapes barely visible even from the air, patterns too subtle for a human glance to register, are being picked out algorithmically at a pace no team of people walking the ground could ever match on their own. Some of these newly surfaced figures are barely larger than a person standing upright. Faint outlines of animals and humanoid shapes, so worn down by time that a human eye scanning the same ground might glance directly over them 100 times without ever registering that they were intentional. Others are larger and clearer, simply located in stretches of desert that had never been closely examined before, overlooked not because they were hidden, but because the sheer size of the search area made a complete, careful survey by human eyes alone almost impossible to finish. Each new discovery adds another figure to a catalog that was, until recently, assumed to be close to complete. It wasn't. It may not be for a very long time yet. Think about what that actually means for a moment. A desert that has been famous, photographed, and studied for the better part of 100 years is still not fully mapped. There are more drawings out there right now, at this very moment, sitting quietly in the dirt, that no living person has ever consciously seen or recognized as intentional. The Nazca Desert is not a finished mystery being slowly explained. It is an active one, still expanding in real time, even as you watch this. And that brings the whole story back to the question sitting at its very center, the same paradox that opened this video and never actually left it. Every shape in this desert, every line, every spiral, every animal figure, was built by people standing on the ground, unable to see the full image they were creating. So who was it truly for? Were these enormous, careful designs meant to be seen by something above, gods, spirits, forces believed to be watching from somewhere beyond human reach? Images crafted specifically for eyes that were never human to begin with? Or was the viewing itself never really the goal, and the entire purpose lived instead in the walking, the tracing, the physical act of moving your own body along a path someone else had carefully planned centuries before you were born, turning the desert into something closer to a memory carried in footsteps rather than an image carried in sight? Nobody currently knows for certain, and perhaps nobody ever fully will. But the next time you see an aerial photograph of the Nazca Desert, showing that unmistakable spider or that elegant, sweeping hummingbird from directly above, remember that the people who made it may never have seen it that way even once in their entire lives. They built something meant for a perspective they themselves could never reach. Was it made for the sky, or was it made for the ground? Tell me what you think in the comments.